Somatic nervous system. Somatic nervous system has three components: sensor, integrator, and effector. That probably sounds familiar to you. So the first component is the sensory input. Sensory receptors sense the information about the outside environment and inside environment. They gather that information and then relay that information by peripheral sensory nerves into the central nervous system to the effector. The second component is the effector in the central nervous system, in the spinal cord and in the brain. Spinal cord and brain process and interpret that information, compare the information that comes from different senses, and then make a decision about what to do next. Once they make that decision is then relayed by the third component of the somatic nervous system, and that is the motor component of the peripheral nervous system, which gives instructions to the effectors, which are muscles and glands, tells them what to do. This can get really, really complicated, so we're going to start with the simplest possible example of how this all works, and that is called the reflex arc. And you've probably already heard of that. What happens when you touch a hot stove, for instance, or a needle? The picture that I use in my handout is of a finger touching a needle on a cactus. It's kind of funny. So if you touch something, hot or painful or something like that, there's going to be a sensor somewhere in the skin, probably in the dermis of the skin of your finger, a pain receptor. That pain receptor is a modified neuron, a modified nerve cell, which means it's going to have an axon. That axon is it's going to be stimulated. You're going to have an action potential running up down that axon, and it's going to go up the arm, all the way into the spinal cord. And so there's only one cell, one axon. So once it gets into the spinal cord, this axon actually makes a couple of synapses onto a couple of other cells. So one of them is what is called a relay neuron or interneuron. That neuron gets stimulated, has its own action potential, and it stimulates a motor neuron, makes a synapse onto the body or of the motor neuron, which then is stimulated, has its own action potential, and that motor neuron instructs the biceps brachii, the muscle, to contract. So it's one sensory neuron, one interneuron, a really, really small neuron in the spinal cord, which is central nervous system, and one motor neuron. Three neurons, one synapse, two synapses, and the third synapse is onto the muscle. That's the neuromuscular junction. Just three synapses. So this thing goes really, really fast. It doesn't have to go through 17 synapses or something like that. Three. Really, really fast. And so as a result, your arm is going to flex. There is also another synapse. So this sensory neuron is also going to make another synapse onto a neuron that normally contracts the opposite antagonist muscle, the triceps, but that synapse is going to be inhibitory. So at the same moment when it's telling the biceps to flex, it's telling the triceps to relax. So this all happens easier and faster. So there's no kind of fight between the biceps and the triceps at the same time. So the relay neuron or the interneuron is also going to make a synapse to another neuron that is going to relay all that information to the brain, just telling the brain what had just happened. But by the time brain gets that information, there's going to be a little bit of a delay. It takes a little bit more, several more synapses. So the action is already done, and then the brain kind of hears about it a little bit later. Hey, that was painful, and my arm moved by itself. So it's the most simple reflex arc, and we've seen them. You can find them in several other places. For instance, there's when the doctor hits your knee with a little rubber hammer, it hits the tendon just underneath the patella. That's a reflex arc. Your knee is going to extend. Your lower leg is going to jump forward, and that is going to be another one of those very very simple systems with one sensory neuron, one interneuron, and one motor neuron doing the job really really fast. So let's go first to the kind of the sensory part of this, and soon after this, we're going to take a look at some detail into the sensory systems, especially the specialized sensory organs like the eye and the ear and the nose. So let's just look at some kind of basic properties of the sensory systems. Uh, some kind of basic terms. Sensation. Sensation is the activation of the sensory receptor cell. It's in the periphery, so it's at the level of the stimulus. So if the receptor cell is stimulated, that's called sensation. Now, sensory perception, that's different. That is processing, conscious, often conscious processing of the sensory information by the central nervous system. So it's much more of a higher level processing. It's not just enough to have a sensation that your, finger, you know, uh, felt pain, but actually that the brain is now considering all of that and thinking about it and processing it and thinking, well, what to do next. So sensory perception is perception by the central nervous system. It's complex, while sensation is simple. A single sensory receptor cell got activated. Sensory receptors can be classified by several different ways. First, there's structural. What is the structure of the cells? Are they very simple, like free nerve endings, like bare, naked nerve endings are usually pain receptors. They're usually found in the skin, but also inside of some of the organs where you have, constipation or gas or something like that. You're going to feel some pain on the inside. Those are also going to be pain receptors. And then kind of bare, naked nerve endings, so no myelin sheaths around it. And they are mostly uh, responding to the chemical. So if there's damage around them, then those damaged cells are going to leak some, cytoplasm with various molecules into the intercellular space, and those pain receptors are going to be in that space. They're going to detect those chemicals. So that is going to be kind of a chemosensation that is responding to chemicals. Very rarely free nerve endings. The pain receptors are actually responding directly to kind of a mechanical movement of the cell itself. Other types by structure are encapsulated nerve endings. So you have a nerve ending, but it has a capsule, which means several different layers of various membranes around it, which are going to potentiate, let's say, touch or vibration, which a single neuron might not be able to detect very well. But if you have a whole bunch of layers of membranes around it, then it's going to be increase the, like, let's say, the vibration. The small vibration becomes big because it's a bigger structure, so it's going to displace that neuron and it's going to respond to it. So you've seen on that model of the skin in the lab and in the picture in the book, there are several different kinds of touch receptors in the skin, in the dermis of the skin. The Meissner's, Ruffini's, Merkel's, and Pacini's corpuscles. They're all slightly different. Some are for light touch, some are for harder touch or pain, some are for pressure, that means touch that lasts for a while, some are for vibration. So they're a little bit more complex than just the free nerve endings. And then you have specialized receptor cells that have special structures and special modifications. So, for instance, photoreceptors in the retina of the eye, hair cells in the ear, those are kind of things that are very specialized and highly modified neurons to become highly specialized receptor cells. Um, Another criterion for classifying sensory cells is the location where they can be found. The most important distinction is between exteroreceptors and interoreceptors. Exteroreceptors are sensing the information that is on the outside of the body, the external environment. So, vision, hearing, touch, those kinds of things, smells, taste. Those are all about things that are coming from the outside environment. Those are exteroreceptors. The interoreceptors are sensing the internal environment. So, yeah, it can be like pain when you have gas, but also levels of oxygen, levels of carbon dioxide, levels of glucose in the blood. A lot of those receptors are on the insides of the walls of arteries and veins of the heart. Then there are proprioceptors. They're involved in balance. They're usually embedded inside of tendons or muscles, and they're stretch receptors, so they monitor like tension and position of the muscles in the body in space. A proprioceptor, proprioception is the sensation of the position of body in space. Uh, and then you can have that also. Kinesthesia is the sensing of the body's movement. Similar types of receptors are going to sense not just the position of body in space, but also the movement of body in space. So those are all going to be interoreceptors. Then functionally, how do you classify receptors is but kind of how they work. Chemoreceptors are sensing chemicals, so smells, taste, or the sensing of blood glucose. Those are going to be chemoreceptors. Most pain receptors are chemoreceptors. They detect chemicals that have been leaked out of the cells that have been damaged. Osmoreceptors are sensing concentrations of solutes in the blood or in other bodily fluids, things like calcium levels, carbon dioxide levels, oxygen levels. Mechanoreceptors are sensory cells that are going to respond if some force changes the shape. So, touch, hearing, balance are mechanoreceptors. Nociceptors are sensing pain, sometimes as mechanoreceptors, but usually as chemoreceptors. Thermoreceptors are sensing temperature, either hot or cold. If it's extremely hot or extremely cold, that is then going to be sensed by pain receptors because it's painful. And then there are photoreceptors that are sensing radiation in the visual spectrum. That is our human visual spectrum. Other animals have visual spectrum a little bit, more into the infraviolet or ultraviolet, or more into the infrared, maybe narrower than us, maybe broader than us. They're going to have a different visual spectrum, but it's still photoreceptor or photoreception. Uh, Organisms like animals, like pit vipers, as snakes, like pit vipers, like rattlesnakes are pit vipers, and some insects, like some types of beetles and wasps. They have specialized receptors that sense infrared. Now, infrared light, that's a photoreceptor. You're sensing radiation in the visual spectrum of those animals. So those are photoreceptors, but they're also thermoreceptors because infrared is hot. They're actually sensing heat. So a sensory modality is a channel, is a type of channel that is specializing on a particular type of stimuli. Sensory modalities of different types are different channels for sensory processing of different types of stimuli. So vision is one modality, hearing is another modality, proprioception is involved in sensing the body in space, in kinesthesia, the body's movement. Those are two separate sensory modalities. Taste is separate from smell. Those are different sensory modalities. Okay, so sensory nerves are then bundles of axons that are connecting the peripheral sensory receptor cell bodies to the integration centers in the central nervous system. So it's not usually not going to be just a single axon going from a single sensory cell to the brain. There's going to be lots of, let's say, touch receptors on the fingertip, and they're going to go together. All the axons are going together, forming a nerve. Once inside the central nervous system, those nerves become known as tracts. So, optic nerves, once they get inside of the brain, become optic tracts. Uh, so these sensory nerves or sensory tracts, they enter the spinal cord by spinal nerves through dorsal roots, while motor neurons exit by ventral roots, or they come into the brain through a variety of cranial nerves. When sensory information is coming from the head, which means it's going to be uh, going into directly into the brain using cranial nerves, is going to be what is called ipsilateral. So if you send something on the left side of the head, it is going to go with the left nerve, sensory nerve is going to go into the brain. It's going to be processed by the left side of the brain. Everything under the kind of the chin, everything that is coming from the rest of the body is going to be what is called contralateral. So everything that's sensed by the sensory cells anywhere in the left side of the body are going to go into the dorsal root ganglia of the spinal cord, and there they're going to cross over. Actually, by the time they get to the brainstem, they're going to cross over. So all the sensory information coming from the left side of the body is going to be processed by the right side of the brain. And if it's coming from the right side of the body, it's going to be processed by the left side of the brain. That is contralateral. So everything above brainstem is going to be ipsilateral. If it comes from the left, it's processed on the left. If it comes from the right, it's processed on the right. If it's below the brainstem, left goes to the right side of the brain. Information from the right goes to the left side of the brain. Okay, so you have received all that sensory information and it went to the central nervous system. The brain and the spinal cord have made decisions what to do. Now they have to tell the effectors what to do. Most of those effectors are going to be what? Skeletal muscles. Remember, voluntary control, conscious control. Some muscle, like diaphragm and intercostals, can be used consciously for speech and unconsciously for breathing. Sometimes, you can consciously, breathe too. You can breathe, faster or deeper if you want to. So that is a voluntary control of the skeletal muscles. So sensory information that is coming from all sorts of, periphery is going to go to the central nervous system, is going to go through various parts of the brain, most importantly through the thalamus, in kind of the bottom and middle of the brain, and then goes to parietal, occipital, temporal lobes into different places where there are specific kind of sensory uh, cortices. So a cortex for vision is going to be in the occipital area on the back. For the hearing and temporal area here, olfactory, that smell is going to be a little bit in the front of the brain. So those are places where sensory information is from a particular sensory modality has its own cortex. Once it gets there, uh, then the decisions are made, and those decisions are made by the frontal lobes of the brain. Now, there's the prefrontal regions, which are involved in memory and self-control and personality, those kinds of things. They don't directly tell muscles what to do, but they can modify your mood to do anything. They can modify the way you think about the sensory information that comes in, and thus modify the decisions that you make about what to do about it. So The rest of the frontal cortex is going to do this. Uh, the the frontal cortex is going to have various parts. We're not going to go into great details about it, but they're going to go through various motor centers that are going to tell muscles what to do. Uh, there are two very interesting parts of the brain called the Broca's area and the Wernicke's area. Broca's area controls the movements that produce speech, while Wernicke's area, that's kind of in front, Wernicke's area is a little bit in the back, and this is a sensory integration center which is involved in understanding language. Damages to the Broca's area or Wernicke's speech area is going to impede speech in some way. One by not understanding language and thus not being able to talk, and the other one by not being able to produce movements that produce speech. So one is a motor area, one is a sensory area, and yet both of them are going to impede speech. For the primary motor cortex is somewhere here. It's roughly here, and it has regions exactly. Exact regions of that are going to correspond to the part of the body, and that was mapped actually. And if you map it, each neuron of that part of that primary motor cortex, to the different parts of the body, it looks sort of like a little human. It's called the homunculus. On the other side of there's a gyrus there. On the other side is the sensory cortex. So the somatosensory cortex and the motor cortex are just on opposite sides of the gyrus, of a little kind of ditch in the surface of the brain. And both of them have a homunculus. And they're going to have uh, similarities. So whatever is like the left thumb and the sensory is going to be right next to across that ditch, that gyrus, from where the thumb is controlled by the motor cortex. And you'll see things that have a lot of sensory receptors for touch, like fingers and lips and tongue, are going to be represented by larger parts, where things like back that don't have as many touch receptors are going to be smaller on that homunculus. Um, there are all sorts of tracts and bed cells and whatnot that we are going to kind of ignore right now. Important thing is that motor neurons, once that all of that is processed and the central nervous system gives a signal for some muscles to contract, that signal is going to go down motor tracts and is going to come out of the spinal cord through the ventral horns. Remember, sensory information goes into the dorsal parts, dorsal sides of the spinal cord, while from the ventral horns, ventral are, remember, closer to the chest, and dorsal is closer to the back. So the front horns of the spinal cord, that's where the motor neurons come out. And motor neurons are then going to go to the skeletal muscles of the body and innervate them, neuromuscular junctions, and tell them to contract. So just like we have in the reflex arc, where it goes straight through the interneuron of the spinal cord, you're going to have the same similar things with movement that are generated by the brain. There are tracts and nerves going down into the spinal cord, and from there, out of ventral horns, the nerves, the motor neurons, go to the muscles and trigger their contraction.